in the audience who still have questions about committing to this platform, that they need to do so, but we need to work together, because this is one elephant that requires a single-minded commitment and unparalleled collaboration among us and between us. Let me pause there and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview. That was really interesting. I guess one of the that sort of keeps coming up when it comes to DOI and sort of African countries is sort of the difficulty of meeting the standard. What were some of the challenges of South Africa, and did you sort of overcome them?
As I said, even as an early adopter, we have biased our engagement with the automatic exchange of information, and we are still struggling with exchange of information on request. But I think that's just institutional inertia and prioritization. On the EOIR, we have received about 150 odd requests. We have only requested 41 since we've adopted this. On the AOEI, however, we have seen significantly more success. We have had over 6 million account records since we've signed up for it through the exchanges of information. And that in itself has yielded significant results, as I've mentioned before. The challenges I've also mentioned, but let me recap. We still find low matching rates, and we have to work and get so where there is a 10-digit identification number, the matching rate is almost 100%. Where there is an identity number, the matching rate is a little bit less, and so the matching rate reduces, and so our gold standard must be to work towards a common identification number across all jurisdictions. So that's the first. The second is, I don't think my colleagues must underestimate the institutional inertia to, one, raise awareness to the level of auditors who actually conduct the auditors, who are not always aware of these instruments that is available to them. And that's just poor internal change management. But the hard work is still to build the capability to get the data, cross-match it, clean it up, and then to superimpose that. One of the weaknesses we had in South Africa, for example, almost 100% of our case selection was triggered by the submission of a return by a taxpayer, which means that the best way to stay out of our crosshairs is to not submit a return. And so we've had to broaden our risk profiling and case selection methodology to also suck into our risk engine other sources of data unrelated to a tax return, and then do an internal check and have, for example, noticed people with high questionable economic activity, locally and abroad, are not even registered for tax. So if we're sitting here waiting for a declaration, we'll never know about them. So we've had to reapproach and reorient our methodology and approach to risk profiling and case selection to risk profile taxpayers, not risk profile returns. And a return is simply one input into the profiling of a taxpayer. So those are some of the internal challenges. And as I said, externally, I think most of my colleagues will join with me to say that revenue authorities are still struggling. They are not sufficiently resourced. It's a function of austerity globally, but I think smart governments would understand that revenue authorities are not cost centers, they're actually investment centers.
Thank you so much for that. I could keep asking you questions, but I've got other that I also need to get to. Okay, so our next panelist is also experienced with how to sort of tackle illicit financial flows with transparency. Mr. Adam El-Hiraika is Director of Macroeconomics and Governance Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. IFFs have been sort of damaging the effects of African countries including in their growth of social economic development and weakening their governance, and importantly, draining resources and tax revenue. Mr. El-Hiraika, what has been the progress of African countries in addressing the recommendations of the high-level report on IFF since 2015.
Good morning. Many thanks, Mr. Hamza. I would like to thank the Africa Tax Initiative for giving us in the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa the opportunity to participate in this panel. And I would like to give you greetings of my Executive Secretary, Vera Songwe, who couldn't join us today. I am really very happy to talk about this issue of illicit financial flows. We started difficult discussions about this back in 2010 during a joint meeting of African Union Commission and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa during annual conference in Malawi. Since then, at that very difficult time, the discussion was very difficult, but I think we have come a long way within Africa, within the United Nations and international organizations, and a lot has been done since then in response to the recommendations of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows chaired by former President of South Africa, Mr. Thabo Mbeki. But equally, many of the key policies remain under-implemented by most African countries. And we heard a lot today about the progress being made in some regards. But let me just mention a few examples. According to our analysis, Mozambique and South Africa have taken, for example, decisions to freeze or review double taxation agreements. Uganda has an open contracting data platform. 7 jurisdictions have introduced legislation that requires the recording of beneficial ownership. And maybe some of you remember how difficult it was to talk about beneficial ownership in Washington especially. These jurisdictions include Botswana, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Tunisia. And Ghana and Kenya launched online central beneficial ownership registries in 2020. However, a lot more is needed, as only 21% of African countries south of the Sahara, we don't use the term sub-Saharan Africa. Until we own our data, then we will be able to see Africa all the time. Now ask countries to submit information on beneficial ownership. And most economies still do not require legal entities to disclose beneficial ownership information at all. So countries including Burkina Faso, South Africa, and Uganda have brought in additional tax revenue using information gained through exchange of tax information. We just heard the commissioner from South Africa talking about how they benefited from EOIE. Mauritius, the Seychelles, and South Africa are also making use of the automatic exchange of tax information. Morocco is pursuing policies against drug trafficking. And a lot has been done actually in this regard, but a lot needs to be done. Hamza. Do you want me to proceed with?
No, yeah. Brilliant. No, thank you. I guess my next question is the exchange of information for tax purposes has proven very effective in the fight against tax evasion and illicit financial flows. However, many African countries have yet to adopt the framework. How should we ensure that more African countries implement exchange of information, and what's the role of ECA, that the ECA can play in this?
Okay, right, okay. Before responding to this question, Hamza, I would like to just say a few things, a few words about what we are doing in ECA to support African countries in this journey. working, of course, with partners from the United Nations and beyond. So in addition to still following up on the recommendations of the high-level panel, working with many institutions, including my friend on my left-hand side, ATAF, and of course OECD and many other institutions in the continent. We continue to do research and to contribute to capacity building among African countries and to help them with institutional reforms needed. So we published a few reports, including our last economic governance report on institutional infrastructure for curbing illicit financial flows from Africa. And just tomorrow we are organizing a meeting with UNCTAD and UN Office for Drugs Control on the closing of a program we started with 12 African countries to work on issues of fighting illicit financial flows by organizing a whole country approach, working groups within countries to work together on this. So the 12 pilot countries will share experiences with the rest of Africa during this meeting. Coming back to your question on the issue of tax evasion, and in particular how countries can really make use of tax transparency and exchange of information in fighting tax evasion and other forms of illicit financial flows. I would like here to really recognize the work that have the OECD and G20 done in this framework to address issues of tax cooperation and through the inclusive framework on PEPs and the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. So the work you have been doing is really helpful in this direction. So exchange of information for tax purposes is important in our view because it helps countries, especially we have tax administrators here who know this better than us. It helps tax administrations to collect revenue from cross-border transactions and activities more effectively and to narrow the tax gap created by international tax evasion and avoidance, and to also help increase corporate profits by reducing profit shifting and hidden offshore wealth. So this can be very helpful to countries, as I said, the tax administrations and commissioners here present know this better than us. And we have seen that over the last few years in a number of African countries, exchange of information and tax transparency improved thanks to digitization. Actually, a few weeks back, we brought a group of African countries here to Nairobi and hosted to a meeting hosted by Kenya Revenue Authority to learn from Kenya's experience in mobilizing excise duties. It was very impressive to see that while in many African countries excise duty makes a small proportion of tax revenue, here in Kenya excise duty makes about 2% of GDP. This is huge by African standards, very huge. And the countries really benefited, the countries we brought here express their appreciation of what Kenya is doing, and they are following up with us, and we are working with them to benefit from this Kenyan experience. So now, because of the progress we have seen in a number of African countries, we are trying to help African countries to benefit and to learn from each other, rather than going abroad and look at experiences that can be very different in terms of context. We need to ensure that more African countries implement exchange of information for tax purposes, and ECA advocated the whole of government approach to addressing IFFs, as I said, bringing different actors within countries to work together. And we are also advocating that African countries should adopt a cost-benefit analysis of companies. When they give licenses to companies, they have to carry out cost-benefit analysis of these companies are going to do, and to make sure that the politicians' companies do not get contracts from government, and there is sufficient information about these companies, and also to strengthen public financial management and pursue international exchange of financial information on country-by-country basis. So there are problems, of course, we have seen preventing some countries from making use of tax transparency and exchange of information. The Honorable Commissioner from South Africa spoke about some of these issues. So we are advocating that where there are problems, African countries need to leverage the platform for collaboration on tax initiative for international cooperation, and also to make use of tax inspectors without borders. So to close, Mr. Chair, I think to ensure better exchange of information, Africa will require, as I said, a whole of government approach, greater interagency collaboration, and better regional and international commitments to leverage information to fight tax evasion and other forms of illicit financial flows. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. And our next panelist is Mr. David Bradbury, Head of Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the Center for Policy and Administration at the OECD. The Tax Policy Statistics Division at the OECD is an interdisciplinary unit that includes economists, lawyers, statisticians, and policy analysts, and it focuses on providing sort of internationally comparable revenue statistics. One of the big things that they've done recently is publish a report assessing the tax compliance and illicit financial flows in South Africa, and it was a joint project between the OECD and the National Treasury of South Africa. Mr. Bradbury, can you walk us through what was what is the approach taken in the report to measure the scale of illicit financial flows in South Africa, and what are the main findings of the report?
Well, thanks very much, Hamza, and thank you, Chair and colleagues. It's great to be able to join you. I too have the regret that I'm not able to be there with you all in person, but I can see it's a very lively and convivial event, and I wish you all the best for the proceedings. As Hamza just indicated, my team has been working with the South African Treasury on a report to quantify the impact and the scale of illicit financial flows in South Africa. There, of course, have been many reports done in the past using a whole range of different approaches. But one of the things that is unique to this particular report and this study is that the data that we have used is really something that has not been used before. And it is data that we have drawn from the CRS. So this is the Common Reporting Standard. Automatic exchange of information related data is the basis of this study. And in addition to that, because we've been working with the South African Treasury, they have been able to access information. All of this, of course, is anonymised to protect the individual taxpayers, but the South African Treasury have been able to analyse in some detail the information that they've collected through their voluntary disclosure programs. And so when you put these two data sources together, the CRS, which really is a new and very rich source of data, And then you also have the information being collected from the voluntary disclosure programs. We're able to undertake a study like no other study that has really been undertaken before. Now, of course, like all studies, it has its limitations, but we think one of the advantages of this study is it gives us the ability to go to very granular microdata. Most of the studies in this area traditionally have involved macro data. So they're looking at big flows of trade and investment without necessarily understanding behind that data what is involved. So we think that, and we hope that this contributes to the ongoing debate around illicit financial flows and brings a new and what we hope will be an approach and a methodology that will be adopted by others. Now, just quickly, what did we find in this study? Now, of course, we know that, like many other countries, South Africa has been taking many steps to try and tackle illicit financial flows, and good progress is being made. But what is clear is there is still more that can be done, and we find that the scale of illicit financial flows in South Africa continues to be significant. In fact, our estimate is that each year, somewhere between, and I should emphasise, we're talking about cross-border flows here, cross-border illicit financial flows. We estimate each year that South Africa loses somewhere in the order of 3.5 to 5 billion US dollars worth of flows as a result of illicit activity. Now, the way we calculate that is we actually start with the stock of offshore wealth that we observe. And that's something that we have estimated to be in the order of 40 to 54 billion US dollars. Now, by matching some of that information with information that has been collected through the voluntary disclosure programs, we've been able to really refine those estimates and we think give them a strong degree of accuracy and robustness, notwithstanding that, like all studies, we do have to make some assumptions. Importantly, a couple of things that we do. We define illicit financial flows to include
the Commonwealth
or use. So they're the three dimensions. But importantly, we identify those flows that are not declared to tax authorities as being illicit in nature. Now, that is not just to focus in on tax evasion. It goes much broader than that. And it goes much broader than that because typically other forms of illicit activities are not disclosed to tax authorities as well. So we do believe that we are capturing illicit financial flows of a much broader nature. So things like drug money, bribes, corruption-related flows, in addition to tax evasion. We think we also will be capturing trade misinvoicing and various forms of money laundering. So by and large, this is an approach that even though it focuses on tax data, it's really agnostic about the type of flow. And we do think that we're capturing a whole range, if not the complete gamut, of the sort of illicit financial flows that countries are rightly concerned about. I should say that we do not seek to capture tax avoidance because we define tax avoidance as not being within that basket of flows that are illicit financial flows. Now, this is an issue that there is some debate around internationally, but the flows that we concentrate on are those, as I said before, that are illegal in either origin, transfer or use. And as we know, as harmful as tax avoidance is, and at the OECD, for years we've been really working with countries to lead efforts to tackle tax avoidance. The thing about tax avoidance is that it often involves companies engaged in various activities that, strictly speaking, may fall within the terms of the law. So they're not illegal in that sense. They're still harmful and they should be tackled. And we have certainly been involved in other projects where we sought to quantify the extent of tax avoidance in different studies. So all of that is to give you a little bit of a picture of what we've found. We also were able to make a series of recommendations and work closely with South African authorities to identify areas where improvement can be made. And, you know, there are many specific recommendations, but perhaps the big high level one that I would just emphasize is that government agencies have to be working together. Now, it sounds obvious, not always easy to do in practice, but there's all of this important information coming to tax administrations as a result of the CRS. Yes, that information has to be processed, applied, and utilised, but it also has to be shared with other sources of information that other government agencies and departments are collecting. Because the truth is that if you want to tackle illicit financial flows, government has to operate in that coordinated and cooperative way, or otherwise you just don't have a chance against those that are engaged in shuffling money and shifting this money offshore for all manner of illegal purposes.
And thank you for that. Are there, I guess, any lessons for other African countries from what you guys learned in this report? Is it replicable elsewhere?
Yes, well, certainly there are a number of lessons, and I should say the first lesson is that the exchange of information works. And how do we find that? We find that in a number of ways. Firstly, when we look at the voluntary disclosure programs where individuals or people come forward and they disclose money that may be held offshore that they haven't previously told the tax authorities about. What we noticed was immediately before the exchange of information, automatic exchange of information came into effect, there was this massive spike in the number of people that came forward and declared assets and wealth that had previously been not declared. We also saw, and this is another interesting finding, that both at the moment when South Africa announced that it would enter into the automatic exchange of information, but then separately when it actually did finally implement in, because they're 2 points in time, at both of those points in time, we saw the number of new filings of new assets that were held offshore spike. So in both instances, we see that transparency, the automatic exchange of information, it sends a very clear message to people who have been keeping their assets held offshore, out of the view of the tax administration, that we're about to shine a light on that. And people come forward, they declare those assets to pay more tax, and in voluntary disclosure programs, they also do the same thing. In terms of lessons for other countries, I think one of the key lessons is that there is a lot to be said for using the data that you've got to better understand the nature of the problem. And this was an important thing that we achieved working with South Africa, was we think we were able to get a much better understanding of the problem. Now, you have a better chance of tackling the problem, I think, when you have that understanding of the problem. But indeed, through that process, we identified many areas where additional work could be done, or better coordination with agencies could occur in order to ensure that a more timely response could be brought into effect by the authorities. And of course, you need to act in a timely way because we know how sophisticated some of the individuals and the various groups that are involved in organised crime and other forms of illicit activity can be. So we think that this particular study, because it allows you to get a really good picture of what's happening in your country, that is a great lesson for other countries. We'd love to be able to work with other jurisdictions to be able to produce a similar study. And we hope that these sorts of studies can also be carried out over time to assess the progress that is made after various measures have been implemented.
Brilliant, really interesting, and thank you for that, David. I'm going to move on to our next panelist, Mr. Logan Vaught, who is the Executive Secretary for the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF. I think he's had a couple shout outs already today. So ATAF understands the need to promote tax transparency and EOI as a tool for enhancing domestic resource mobilization in Africa, and has been in the front line of building effective tax administrations to help them harness the potential in their development in Africa. My first question for you, Mr. Ward, is what do African countries need to use? What do African countries need to be able to use tax transparency and EOI effectively as weapons to fight illicit financial flows in Africa?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hamza. Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, thank you to Commissioner General Mburu for the great hospitality to KRA, and also allow me to acknowledge the chairperson of ATAF, Mr. Philip Chodi, who is the Director General of Office Togolese de Recette. You know, a lot has been said about the benefits and the impact, and best illustrated by the last two presentations, amongst others. The presentation by South Africa illustrates very practically both the results and the impact and what is needed to achieve the best out of the EOI transparency fight. So what I want to share is that firstly, a country needs to accept that engaging in exchange of information, automatic or on request, is beneficial. It yields results, and it is the key to dealing with illicit financial flows. There must be an acceptance of that. There are two areas that is, amongst others, I'd like to start off with what countries need to engage in beneficial, to engage in tax transparency and use EOI as a weapon. The first is legislation, and the second would be the treaty networks and getting the treaty networks in place. On legislation, a country needs to have the right legislation in place to allow exchanges to take place. Now, in these presentations today, we've heard of different strategies countries have used, interagency cooperation, beneficial ownership, and then the exchange of information cross-border. Now, to allow a tax authority to have access to taxpayer information, there's the tax code, the tax act that allows for that. But to get information, as Mr. Kisviter earlier spoke about, that is not in the filing, you need other sets of legislation. You need legislation that allows you access to the banking activities. You need legislation that allows you access to the trade activities, to the central bank transactions that goes through, and this information you do not get in a normal tax act. And so when we talk about the right legislation, we're talking about the gambit of legislation that is not limited only to what is in the Income Tax Act. So we've got to get the right legislation in place for the EOI system to work and for interagency cooperation inside the jurisdiction to work. Of course, on the treaty networks, you need a good treaty network in order to exchange information with other countries. On the issue of the right legislation, the legislation do not only deal with exchange of information legislation. I think Mr. Bradbury, in his exposition of the research into South Africa, spoke about the various instruments they use to look at illicit financial flows, and he defined it as those that are illicit. The biggest form of illicit financial flows in Africa actually happens through tax avoidance. And so that particular study would not have picked it up, as you rightfully suggest. But there are legislative instruments that we need to deal with tax avoidance, because it's actually a bigger form of loss than evasion itself. And for that, ATA, for example, have put together a guideline on transfer pricing legislation for African countries. We've put together a guideline on interest deductibility rules, on thin capitalization. So those are other sets of rules to minimize the so-called legal ways in which people are reducing the revenue take of African jurisdictions. And that's an important part of that legislation. On the tax treaty networks, what's important, Africa has too few treaties, it has weak treaties, and I'm glad in the earlier presentation by Dr. Alderica next to me, he spoke about some countries that are renegotiating those treaties. That's very important. What are the other elements? I think it's important to invest in infrastructure and information exchange. The type of infrastructure that allows, as Mr. Kisviter illustrated, you to say, if you receive 6 million pieces of data that allows you a $30 billion US potential income, you need computers to process this. You need analysts to dissect the information. You need data security. For all of this, you need an investment, and people said here that we do not invest enough in tax administration. So an important part of this is to have competent authorities that are able to have trained people, but also to have especially information security and information technology infrastructure. Of course, we need policies. So let me quickly go on to say what other things are needed. We need the proper policies and we need capacity building. In capacity building, we're particularly looking at some of the issues raised earlier, but we need to train competent authorities. We need to train data analysts, and we need tax inspectors that are able to use the information. In a lot of the audits, exchange of information data is not accessed or not even aware of. So there's a disjuncture, as Mr. Kiswete tried to illustrate earlier, between the traditional audit and that which has become available over the last decade through these international cooperative instruments such as exchange of information. Of course, two important elements in conclusion of the section. Access to multinational enterprise information, access to commercial databases is important, and it's incredibly expensive. ITAF has for the past 4 years purchased those licenses, and through that purchase have allowed access to all our members to access those licenses, and have been able to, as part of our own $3 billion of tax money returned, have been using those databases in local jurisdictions in order to do that. So accessing that databases is important. A robust automation process within the automatic exchange of information, like some of the work in those countries that have automatic exchange of information, like the work we're starting to do, Commissioner General Mburu here in KRA with you, in preparation for automatic exchange of information. The final point I want to make, Hamza, on this point, is for me a very important point. A lot of the obstacles dealing with transparency and information exchange and the type of legislation that we need, and the fact that we struggle to get this, I had a few conversations during coffee here, the struggle to get this legislation through Parliament, the struggle to get it through to the state law advisor, the struggle to get it through to the ministries. A lot of this probably can be circumvented if we try and deal with the issue of country by country reporting differently. And I want to suggest that a key policy consideration must be to allow for the local filing of M&E subsidiaries in that jurisdiction. For example, African countries have very limited EOI mechanisms, and they have equally limited treaty networks. In some instances, some jurisdictions are not even party to the multilateral instrument that Grace was talking about. But even for those who have ratified the MAC, if dealing with a multinational enterprise, for example, from the US, this is an example, and noting that the US is a major economy and home to many multinational enterprises and ultimate parent entities, and that they operate within African countries, and given the fact that in this example I'm making, the US is not part of the MAC, it means that countries won't be able to receive a country-by-country report from the US. This is because the US has treaties only with 4 African countries, and so it's not obliged to send these reports to countries for whom it's not concluded these contracts. And that's very important. And as a result, there's a glaring gap, as most African countries won't receive country-by-country reports from the bulk of M&Es, because the majority of them operates within the US in my example. And in reality, for this reason, we need to give consideration, and the Africa Initiative must take this as part of its agenda, that local filing would address these gaps. That means a subsidiary should be required to file their country-by-country report in the jurisdiction where it files its tax return. And thus, it addresses a lot of the EOI requirements that we're trying to address in this meeting. So ITAF has been working on this. We've got a working group on exchange of information and involved in the setting up of competent authority offices across the continent, 24 so far, and also we have a rapid response facility. It's a program that provides tax auditors across the continent in an inter-African exchange program. And through this program, we've been able to engage in audits in a number of African countries up to now. So those are the initial responses to your question, Hamza. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I guess like some of this you've already touched on, but can you walk us through what you think the African initiative should focus on next?
Well, I think in terms of what the Africa Initiative should focus on next is in the tax transparency report that was launched here today, there are a number of striking points in there. The limited amount of exchanges that has taken place, some of the infrastructure challenges, and I think it's important that we try and address that in a very sort of operational way. We've seen part of that report has got a number of cooperating partners if you look at the back of that report. And we must get our partners involved because this is a very resource-rich project and many countries on the continent. As my colleague Dr. Alderica says here, we're not talking about sub-Saharan Africa, Africa south of the Sahara. There's a lot of resource constraints in setting up the technology, the training, and so on. And we should have the confidence to provide these resources to those countries. We should have the confidence to provide those resources to the continent and then to facilitate the use of those resources. I think we need to do that. I think the Africa Initiative must take up the issue of localized country-by-country reporting that I have just mentioned. But importantly, we need to broaden the partners that we work with. ATAF works, for example, with a number of African partners in this. This includes the African Union, the African Development Bank, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the Tax Justice Network. It's important to have those on-continent alliances. You have a different result. And with the Africa Initiative strengthening this, I think that we can even improve and enhance some of the good findings within the tax transparency report. But we must use the outcomes of that report. Globally, the work we do with the Global Forum, CREDAF, CATA, and the West African Tax Administration Forum is important. So those workings, because all of these institutions I am mentioning are working with the members around this table, the African countries around this table, and others who are not here in those jurisdictions. And we need to broaden this beyond who is doing what, but we need to broaden this and put in an evaluation and a monitoring mechanism that measures what we bring back, that measures what we have planted, and so that we can, across organizations and in partnerships, work far more efficiently. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I'm aware that we've sort of run over ever so slightly, but I wonder if we can have maybe one question from the audience. So this is a question for Commissioner Kisweta. Can the Commissioner Kisweta please offer his insights into whether South Africa is likely to renegotiate double tax treaties between South Africa and other countries? And I think that must pertain to what Mr. Vaught was just sort of mentioning, that a lot of inter-African tax treaties cause sort of an issue for tax transparency.
Thank you, Chair. I've actually just typed a response to the question, but let me share the response publicly. The OECD Model Convention makes no proposal for withholding tax at all. it simply allows for a rate to be negotiated between two countries. In the case of the specific question, with the country involved, the DRC, the UN model approach has been followed, which suggests a 10% withholding tax level. This has been the negotiated agreement between the two countries, and is therefore currently in practice.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much to all of my panelists. It's been fascinating hearing how African countries are sort of piercing the veil of secrecy, and hopefully, we can, as African countries, sort of say that we've ended bank secrecy along with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Hamza Ali. I think we can applaud Hamza for a job very well done and having interrogated that subject fully. And let me also appreciate the panelists, starting with Ms. Grace, Edward, David, Adam, and Logan, for prosecuting that agenda fully. It is very clear that while a lot has been achieved in terms of improving transparency in Africa, from what we see in the report, we still have to continue the work as Africa Initiative to ensure that many more African countries sign the agreement that allows them to have access to many more jurisdictions to be able to exchange information with. It's also very clear that many more African countries need to have the capacity to utilize those tools to be able to request for information and to make use of it in their domestic revenue mobilization. And I believe that the Africa Initiative will need to continue this agenda of bringing on board as many African countries to sign these tools and also enhance their capacity to continue in utilizing these tools so that we can, as a continent, derive maximum benefit from these tools that have been made available to us. I think coming out of that conversation again is that we have continued to lose a lot of money from our continent through illicit financial flows. And coming out again is that the increased tax transparency in Africa, and indeed in the world, will continue to play a role in addressing the gap or in providing information that is going to be used to deal with illicit financial flows. So as we address tax evasion and tax avoidance, we will be also addressing the illicit financial flows that come with it. So thank you very much, panelists, for that. And I want to thank our audience, both who are here present physically and those who are attending virtually. Thank you for being there and participating, and also even asking the questions for that, and continuing with this engagement. I think we have come to the end of that session, and I would like to now welcome the delegates for lunch, and also request that we be here at exactly 2 p.m. Kenyan time, so that then we can progress with our agenda. Thank you very much, and welcome for lunch.
Thank you very much, our chair, and all our participants for that very engaging session. I'm here to just give us instructions on our lunch. But before we go for lunch, esteemed delegates, I got a report that not all of us were present for the group photo, and since we want to take it home as a memorabilia, then I believe we're full house and we shall take a group photo. We have arranged a fantastic place up at the rooftop, and we shall have our ushers guide us there. It's just going to take us 2 minutes. We'll take a great group photo for the entire team here. We've got a lot of space up there, and it's just going to be out, and our ushers are going to lead you up to where the rooftop is. After that photo session, esteemed delegates, we're going to go for lunch at the gardens, and our ushers will guide us to where the gardens are located, where it's set up for your meal. And then, as the chair has guided, we shall be back by 2:15. So just in case you have any questions, I just want to identify again our ushers. Miss Judy, please rise up. If you see anybody in this coat, please ask them for all directions and any support that you require, and we're happy to support. So ladies and gentlemen, please let's go up to the rooftop, take our photo, and then we shall be guided to our lunch area.
Okoye is still here with us. Justina Wangoi wa my party presidential team here, one of the only 4 who have been cleared by IBC to run for the state biggest top job. Let's see some of your feedback and the questions you're asking here on JK Live. Let's bring that up and pose some of them. Joseph Mayani says, kindly ask them if they have other aspirants like governors, senators, MP and MCA vying with Roots Party. Quick reaction to that.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes.
We have not seen any of them being...
No, we don't. What happened actually is our scrutiny method was so rigorous. A lot of them were disqualified at the primary level. Just like I was disqualified when I was running for Member of Parliament for Tottenham after the death of Barney Grant in UK. I was disqualified at the primary level just because I was not married, but I had children. They wanted to see a real certificate of marriage. We have applied the same method in Roots, and that's why we didn't care. People came in or have money, and we looked at them. There's a questionnaire for them to fill in, which was actually in tandem with Chapter 6. So if you didn't answer us, just go. So we are, I think, the only party which has really scrutinized our candidates, and we have very few.
And we didn't eat their money for free. We know many political parties make you pay party fees and they don't give you the ticket. So us, we are very transparent. We told them